Hi, everyone. I teach this summer and the silence has gotten to me really badly. So I decided to play music before the session started. We're right at 4 o'clock. And so welcome. We still have some people, chiming in, which is such a surreal experience because they don't see people coming in. Yeah. So I'm Sherry Craig. Lindsay Clark is also here. We've got a nice lineup for you, I guess, if that's what we're calling them. Lindsay has pre-recorded her video because she's more on top of life than I am. And so you'll be watching her video, but a chance to engage in live Q&A with her. And I've got a traditional PowerPoint slide where something's probably has a big typo and a misspell or something's going on with that PowerPoint to give you that real conference experience. I probably have a link that doesn't work as well. And so just thinking about how to make this as realistic as possible. I function as the chair for our session. And so sort of our goal is to, one, keep my 9-month-old from driving everyone crazy. So dad's got him out of the house for a little bit, advance apologies. And two, to keep us on track, but also to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A. I haven't timed myself because I was like, it's a 2-person session. How much could I talk? But again, I am a summer teacher and a teacher, so probably the entire hour. So we'll let Lindsay go first, and then I'll go second as per our program describes. Does that sound good, Lindsay?
Yes, I'm chatting with Michael right now because my recording is uploaded somewhere, but we're not exactly sure where.
I can go first.
Michael, do you have any idea?
So why don't you go first, Sherry, and I will locate that recording.
Okay.
And just a quick reminder before we get started on a tech note to please mute yourself as we are recording the sessions in speaker view. So if you happen to be unmuted and talking, it will show you in the recording instead of the presentation speaker. But yeah, Sherry, if you don't mind going first, I will locate that recording for you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Michael Todd. Great name. Nice, simple. I appreciate it. Cool. I think I'm unmuted. I've got my screen shared. So I'll say a little bit about myself. I'm Dr. Sherry Craig. I'm from between institutions. I'm will be a professor at Virginia Tech University here in a couple of weeks. My talk today is called Rising to the Diversity Challenge in Business Writing Courses. And so thinking about the potential for diversity really in business writing courses. If you'd like to see my slides, they're available at this tiny URL. I also can make them available in other ways. I have a version of them that is more ADA friendly in some ways, simplified for you if you're interested. And so I'd like to position myself within this research. I find it increasingly important to do so as I think about my relationship as a Black woman doing this kind of work, but also thinking about some of the good action that's taken place across the fields, really coming out of the protests and the heavy violence in 2020 and previously. And so mostly I situate myself among diversity, equity, inclusion, those nice big 3 things, but then really also around belonging, particularly for Black women, around mentoring and training and storytelling. And the work that I'm doing right now really is about how do Black women need to be supported, trained, or mentored to have success and advancement in the workplace. And so for me, workplaces aren't just defined as these, corporate America or this industry sort of workplaces, but also our institutions as workplaces. And so a lot of the conversations that I do, and actually the diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting work that I do, just finished a consulting gig, I suppose, with an engineering firm in the suburbs of Philly. And so thinking about how that work leads into or easily connects to the work that we do in our institutions or need to do in our institutions. And so some of what I'm talking about today is related to this idea of professional writing, self-efficacy, training, professionalism, around this idea of how writing courses themselves inform the development of Black women's early careers. And this bit for IWAC really is less about Black women in particular and more about our students and their professional development. And they're sort of thinking about what do they take from our courses, particularly ones that are writing in the disciplines, but also thinking about preparation courses, right? Courses that were like, these are practicum in a way that you're going to be doing this work when you go forward. I'm a big supporter of that our institutions are responsible for producing future leaders of industry, but also future leaders in our society. And so when we think about the role of our courses and my role as a Black woman instructor, what power and what privilege do I have when engaging with sometimes hundreds of students a year? And so I'm going to open up by just providing some quotes that help frame my work. And everything that I quote in this chunk, I would say, comes from a Black woman. I try to do that deliberately. There's lots of other people I could be citing, and even people from writing studies and from rhetoric and composition. But when you have a platform, why not share Black scholars? So Lorraine Hansberry, most famous for A Raisin in the Sun, died young, far too young. She says, write if you will, but write about the world as it is and as you think it ought to be and must be, if there is to be a world. Write about all the things that people have written about since the beginning of writing and talking, but write to a point. Work hard at it, care about it, write about our people and tell their story. And so for me, my people is Black women or Black people generally, but also thinking about our people as this qualitative sort of narratology or sort of counter-story situatedness that our research gets to do when we talk about writing, we talk about our students. So Audre Lorde, the Audre Lorde. And so when the words of women are crying to be heard, we must, each of us, recognize our responsibility to seek those words out, to read them and to share them and to examine them and their pertinence to our lives, that we not hide behind the mockeries of separations that have been imposed upon us and which we so often accept as our own. And so here she's talking about women, but for me in particular, thinking about Black women and the separation of their relationship to the world. And so making sure that we are emphasizing and bringing those voices to light. Bell hooks. And so the idea around home place, which for me to help situate our research, my research as creating a sense of belonging for all students, and for bell hooks, particularly Black women in particular, a construction of safe spaces where Black people affirm one another, and by doing so, heal many of the wounds inflicted by racist dominations that we had an opportunity to grow and develop and to nurture our spirits. My classrooms, and when I approach writing, particularly thinking about diversity and the challenge of it, it is to create spaces for growth and development, for nurturing, and to do so in really responsible ways and at every opportunity possible. And so I want to ask all of you, like, who doesn't love a business bro? And I say that lovingly. I love my business bros. And this is a little bit, you know, jokingly said, but I will walk into a business writing classroom and here you are, one point in the semester, they're coming in with a collared shirt, most likely a polo. They've got that khaki on. They've got a certain swagger. The young women do too. The non-binary students in business do too. And we understand them, if you taught them, that they are predominantly male, and at almost every institution, save for HBCUs and HSIs, predominantly white. Most institutions themselves, most workplaces themselves are predominantly white and often male. I switch those depending on the industry. But when we think about business writing, we're not necessarily thinking about, in many ways and in many institutions, where we see this being broken, right? Where we see those diversification, where we see the predominant women, where we see different types of class issues and labor issues coming to the forefront. When we sort of stereotypically think of business and stereotypically think of technical writing or walk around our own campuses, for me, this is the picture. And in my experience across 3 different institutions, this is what I'm teaching. Like, this is sort of who I'm thinking about. I think who many of us think about. And so for me, there's also good trouble to be had in these spaces because it's such an opportunity and we shouldn't waste it. And so most of what I'm talking today about is taking advantage of these conditions, of an assumed condition where in a business writing class or even a technical writing class, there's going to be probably a predominantly male audience, students, and probably a predominantly white audience, the students, thinking about their workplace preparation as well, no matter what their bodies are. And so when I think about, I say and so a lot, that's so interesting. I notice this, I teach a lot, Zoom catches everything. But when we think about diversity, it's sometimes easy to think about gender inclusion, and much of the work that we might read, right? Thinking about textbooks and thinking about some of the more prolific stuff that's available for us to consider with diversity in the workplace or diversity in business gets down to gender. And it's not that that's not so important, right? We know that the Me Too movement has forced the hand to further advance gender equity in the workplace, even though it had advanced even more. And here we are again, the protests of 2020 surrounding anti-Black racism, specifically anti-Black racism and police violence has, and will continue to force the hand to further advance racial equity in the workplace. And so we're in this sort of interesting context where I find my students wanting to talk about pro-Blackness and anti-racism, right? That's like fantastic keyword that we all got to hold on to for the last year and a half. But also they have some sense of gender inclusion because of, conversation about the glass ceiling or sexual harassment. You know, we can watch a great episode from The Office that's all about sexual harassment, and they love that. And so they have a handle on some of this, and thinking about diversity as one aspect of a more diverse workplace being a more gender inclusive workplace, but more racially inclusive, and a sense of belonging for those different races and different bodies becomes much more the focus of the work that I do. And so thinking about the different status quos, because of not only the student population, but thinking about science and thinking about business more broadly, we see that masculinity is oftentimes the forefront and that competition is inherently built into it. And so rising to the top, you know, winning the pitch, we get a lot of sports metaphors that come into both of these fields, despite some of the deep nerdiness in there. But we also get from Read et al. That hegemonic masculine behaviors like competitiveness and the idea of being tough, like you have to suck it up, buttercup sort of attitude, or you know, even like expectations around golfing in business, or around sort of late night in the lab all day, screw your family sort of attendance in order to be the top scientist, doesn't necessarily allow for it not to be this hegemonic sort of masculine attitude. And so these are socially constructed and often easily located within business and engineering in particular. And so to think about these things, I developed a soft pilot. It was halted because of COVID and sort of what our IRB had done. In light of that, thinking about the approval of new studies under certain conditions and everything. And so instead of the 2-year study described in the description for this talk, I'm just sharing sort of what came out of the 1-year soft pilot and not the formal 2nd year. So 34 people total, is that math right? Yeah. So 25 men, 9 women, traditionally aged, mostly white students, some Black, 1 Latinx, and 1 Southeast Asian, enrolled in my 300 level business writing course, predominantly majors in our College of Business and Public Management, 1 English major, 2 other, like 1 computer scientist and something else, maybe like, I don't know what that was. And they all took a brief survey just to inform the IRB and sort of the questions that I was asking. So in relationship to the survey and sort of things that informed their answers, I teach a genre-based approach using workplace scenarios and a lot of co-writing. I wouldn't necessarily call it collaborative writing because I think that's much more difficult than what I have my students do, almost like cooperative writing in many ways. The first project is a hiring. We focus on hiring documents and hiring biases. They have to read about and write about and examine hiring ads and documents related to their own sort of hiring practices and job docs. Then we talk, they create human resource incident reports, write memos, and release new policies related to the incident reports, starting with a brief case study that I produced for them, and then they sort of respond to that. Project 3, one of the biggest things in the semester is a corporate case study where students look at everything from Ben & Jerry's and how they sort of navigate and publicly announce their support for diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, anti-Asian hate, all sorts of wonderful things, but also some companies that have gotten into a little bit of trouble around some of those areas, like Snapchat, or even more recently, Blizzard video games. And so thinking about that, they then produce a recommendation report, and then project 4 to end the semester, a collaboratively developed diversity initiative proposal, and then a training program that has a formal report attached to it. And so these projects scale up. We sort of continue our conversations around these issues throughout, and we can see them doing this work in relationship to the class. All of the readings for my class come from Harvard Business Review. It's free for my students, but also students can access the system up to 2 articles, and then they can register and get more. So I'm really sort of cost efficient when I assign things. But also I know from the consulting work that I do that this is a journal that people who don't have access to libraries read and might have in their break room. And so for me, really sort of emphasizing that workplace possibility. So some of the things that they might read in the class is like how to reduce personal bias in hiring from 2019 towards a racially, socially just workplace, to really one emphasis that we have is why diversity programs fail, how they are committed to diverse hiring still fail. And so this idea that you can have all the right policies and you can have all the right sort of paperwork around these issues, but there's still failure attached. And so we spend quite a bit of time leading into the 3rd and 4th project, really sort of emphasizing that you could design something amazing and that doesn't solve the problem, something we see in our own institutions, I'm sure. We also use the job accommodation network. So not only are my students thinking about race and diversification of workplaces and sort of navigating some of these issues in relationship to race, we also do it around accommodations for differently abled bodies, right? And so what I love about the job accommodation network is that it's a real resource. They can exchange email with them if they want to. They never do. But in this A to Z part here, it allows for them to look up a variety of understood disabilities, everything from pregnancy, chronic migraines, missing limbs, blindness. So some ones we sort of understand as disability and ones that are not socially understood as disability sort of broadly. And students can navigate that and do some work around different accommodations that are legally and not so legally, but really fucking nice, available for to offer for employees. So diversity isn't just about, again, sort of thinking about gender, which we talk about a lot, but all types of incorporating of diversity within the workplaces and within our class conversations. So the pilot results, so taking all of this coursework and all the stuff that students are doing and giving them the survey, so far, I guess last year, so funny thing about this should have happened last year, but some students demonstrated just pure enjoyment or sort of like, I'm here for it, Dr. Craig. So before this class, I had no idea that these diverse issues were an issue in the workplace. I assumed the laws and stuff that we created in the 1960s help make things fair. Plus, affirmative action and everything, learning about all this stuff, other stuff helped me when I own my own company. So several of my students are entrepreneurs. They're very convinced they're going to own their own company. And much like this student sort of was like, oh, well, affirmative action helps Black people. And we go from sort of that conversation to really looking at affirmative action, like studies and data, to talk about how the number one population that is most benefited from it are actually white women and not people of color of any gender. And what that sort of means for us as a culture, right? And sort of how this assumption that everything's been fixed since we had the civil rights movement, what does that mean for us now? And so we see a student reflecting on going beyond this initial, like, okay, well, our workplaces are diverse. Another student talking about diversity all semester was hard. I was worried about people judging me, but then I got really into writing about other people and their experiences. What's interesting about this one is that in my predominantly white classrooms, asking students to write about diversity and like create case studies and to study the experiences of others, we fall really easily into stereotype and fall really easily into having them examine their own challenges around race. One question that I ask my students is, what does your friend group look like? And we spend a little bit of time doing some identity work and doing a little bit of identity politicking in the classroom to sort of consider, like, if you don't talk to Black people or have Black people friends outside of work, how do you do that at work, right? Like, how does that translate? I'm just having more of a frank conversation with them. So we see a student reflecting on that. Some of the responses were less than anonymous. So it was good to have a professor who can help me understand what my job might be like and the struggles of other African-American women like me. So the student identifying with my own identity status and sort of making some connections with the material and with what she may be experiencing. I'm very open with my students. I have shared my struggles in the workplace, both academic workplaces and industry workplaces, to help give them perhaps some of their own bravery when talking about this. And then again, not so anonymous, I think Miss Craig, not my name, but that's all right, makes too big of a deal out of addressing diversity at work. My job is very diverse and everyone likes each other and we don't have none of these problems. Sometimes I feel like she wanted us white dudes to feel guilty for being the most popular in jobs. Cool. But sort of thinking here about, not every student, as we know, is going to be like gung-ho for thinking about these issues or for themselves, right? Rising to that challenge, sort of seeing it as either busy work or something that doesn't have anything to do with them, or that they've already done this work for themselves. Why do they need to do this work then in the classroom? So some other information, sort of thinking about the more qualitative responses led me to really understand that the instructor identity influences the student's development. I collaborate with a good friend of mine who's at Sacramento State. He's a straight white male, and he teaches two of the assignments that I also teach. Yes, we're writing about it. And his conversations with students and his students' like embracement of the diversity question is way different than mine. And so sort of thinking about the qualitative responses I shared with you and the other work that I'm doing, I can tell you that the instructor identity absolutely influences the students' understanding of everything. But most participants demonstrated a strong or very strong belief that the class expanded their definition of diversity. Most participants agreed or strongly agreed that they would be able to become advocates for themselves or others in their current or future workplaces. Most participants agreed or strongly agreed that their ability to construct relevant and timely business writing genres improved during the course. Most participants agreed or strongly agreed that they were more work ready after completing the course. So the questions that I was asking them were sort of twofold. You can see in the first two sample questions here, asking them much more about diversity and much more about sort of imagining themselves or placing themselves within that workplace. And then the other one really about the course itself, thinking about business writing itself, the genres, and this idea around work readiness, and being able to then take those skills into the workplace. Generally, sort of across the board in this kind of data, the students were positive, right? They were like, yeah, we're here for it. We believe that this is a thing. Now, the students who completed the survey did it on a completely voluntary basis. There was no incentive around extra credit. There was no incentive around a higher grade or anything. They just happened to be nice students who did this survey that I threw out at them one day. It was like, could you guys please just sort of do this? I'm trying to do this other thing. And they were really awesome about it. And so was my department in allowing me to sort of poke at my own students. And this was just one small population. I had 75 business writing students in 2019-2020. And this is just, about half of them, and only 3 sections of about 15 we were running that semester. So it really is just a small subset. And because of COVID and my shifting institutional home, this will need to shift. And so my next steps has already been to retool what my central question is. I need to then recruit new students. I need to run it and, of course, write. And so my research question has been shifted into how does writing workplace-based diversity training programs, policies, initiatives influence student professionalism and work readiness on these topics, particularly in the classes and in the programs for undergraduate students. So really trying to get at, is there a stronger belief and a stronger understanding of the needs for diversity and the needs for these types of situations that they might be encountering at work, and their ability to handle those after addressing them in the class. So a little bit less about their writing and more about what they perceive and what they understand they'll be handling at work. And so part of that retooling also might be just thinking about students taking internships. That way we can look at how this conversations in the class sort of come up for them in these internships. So instead of trying to grab them after they graduate as these early career folks, maybe just thinking about the internship as sort of this influential point in their careers, thinking about addressing the limitations of instructor identity. At my former institution, I'm the only faculty of color that teaches business and technical writing. That absolutely has some limitations. At most institutions, I would be the only faculty of color teaching this kind of class or this kind of work. Because I'm housed in English, this isn't necessarily inclusive of business writing or business communication classes that might happen in a college of business, where the professors, instructors tend to be a little bit more diverse depending on the institution. But I do think that there's some limitations to that instructor identity and students' overall comfort and students' overall ability to then understand and digest conversations around diversity. My students wrote as good as other semesters. So one of the things that required retooling is I wasn't necessarily seeing better writing because I changed what they were writing about. Instead of doing more general topics around business writing or sort of leaving it open where they could choose any topic related to industry, I didn't see any necessarily improvement, but this is not looking at, there was no control group who wrote on other stuff and students who wrote on diversity. So sort of thinking around that as well. And then really developing the IRB approved protocol to try to grab BIPOC students and white students, so more of a balance of that. And then perhaps even those early career professionals, people who are now looking back on the class and being able to do it. So perhaps an even longer longitudinal look at writing and at diversity in the workplace. for me, it all sort of comes down to this comic, which has floated around a lot in the world. We use it in usability studies. Generally, if you clear the ramp, everyone can go up, right? So if we shovel the ramp, everyone gets in, versus clearing the stairs so this other group can get in. And so I sort of take it to what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? If we can address what's good for one population or one group, it's going to work for everyone else. So if my Black students in the class or my students of color in the class feel like they have something to talk about, feel like they can grasp onto these ideas, as well as learn the genres and the writing moves that are expected in the class and in the program and in the college, then everybody wins. And if one person's slightly uncomfortable and they just happen to be the most dominant business bro, they will also benefit from these situations. So 5 ways to rise to the challenge is to adapt your reading. So we don't use a textbook in my course because I find that most business writing and technical writing textbooks are basically all the same and roughly $120. I'm sorry if you're a textbook writer, but there's instruction on those genres that can be provided for free in other ways. And so I leave the readings to be more along the lines of this topic or the theme of the class around diversity in the workplace. Challenge collaborative expectations. And so I had one student, and I say this because I can't stop thinking about it. I had one Black student come to me and said, Dr. Craig, why'd you partner me with this white boy? And I was like, what? He's like, why do I gotta work with this white boy, Dr. Craig? We had lots of Black students in the class. You took all the Black students and you partnered them with white people. And I was like, what? I knew I had done it, but it was like, why are you in my office about this? And he was like, I just want the opportunity to not have to work with them. And I said, you know, we all have to work with each other. Could you imagine a white student coming to my office and saying the same thing that you just said? And he got mad. He's like, no, that's racist. I was like, well, what you're saying isn't necessarily racist because racism is rooted in so many other oppressions, but we want to think about this. And so pushing students and pushing myself to really think about what does collaboration mean? And why do we have students and how do we have students collaborate? My student groups are as diverse as possible, men and women working together, different races working together, different, sometimes I have different ages. So post-traditional students, I'm making sure that they're folded into the mix. I control the student group making. It's not random or anything. Yep. Thank you for the comment. I appreciate that. And so thinking about incorporating those gen ed tags as if possible. And so our business writing course doesn't have gen ed associations with it outside of like it satisfies gen ed, but could it have satisfied diversity because so many butts in those seats? That's something that's possible. And having a conversation with instructors and the powers that be about the potential for these conversations in a course that's hitting so many different students across the institution. So quickly, for me, it's about more than anti-racism and about less than anti-racism. This stuff isn't necessarily an anti-racist approach to teaching business writing. It's about incorporating the ideas, the conversations around an idea, all the classes and all the discipline and in really meaningful ways. It's about creating expectation of discussion and understanding for all people, with all people, and then writing about it just becomes part of the fun. I think what we're going to do instead of having Q&A for me is we'll run Lindsay's recording and then do Q&A for both folks. My slides are available there and we'll watch Lindsay's video and then allow for each of us to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. That was fantastic. Before I start the video, Lindsay, is there anything you'd like to say, or should I just go right into it?
Just thank you for handling that. And I pre-recorded because I wasn't sure I was going to be here because of a work trip. So I'm so happy to be here. And if there's any details I left out, which I probably did, the video is about 17 minutes long. I'm happy to talk more about it. But essentially, I'm sharing my experience with a special topics course where the end result of that was a student created book project, and how that sort of revealed some ideas and conversations about ethics and communication with these business majors as well. So I hope you enjoy it, and I look forward to questions on the other end. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Can everyone see that all right?
Hi, everyone. This is Lindsay Clark. I teach business communication at Sam Houston State University. And my presentation is Writing Executive Narratives. Students think critically about communication in business. And I just wanted to share a little bit today about a cross-department collaboration to create a writing intensive course that builds students' critical thinking skills. So we know that communication skills always are ranked as highly important and highly marketable by employers. But there are some other studies that suggest that recent graduates in particular don't quite have that proficiency, especially with oral communication. In the summer of 2019, our business college leadership initiated a SWOT analysis, trying to understand those most marketable skills that employers in our area around Houston, Texas are looking for, as well as how the skill levels of our recent graduates match their needs. We found in that SWOT analysis that there were really 4 areas that needed our attention, which we call them soft skills. And those were communication, leadership,
Michael, we lost audio when you muted yourself.
Let me just backtrack a little bit.
students to read about. And so together, we came up with the idea of creating a course around this speaker series. She, coming from management, and me from general business and finance, came together to think about how we can support students' learning of soft skills. She recruited speakers, I recruited students, and we ended up with 14 junior and senior business majors who agreed to participate in this new class for elective credit, knowing that it would be writing intensive and that it would end in a book project for their peers. So in spring 2020, we had 6 speakers come in. One of them ended up over Zoom because of COVID, but you can see we had a lot of formidable leaders in our area. President of an energy development company, CEO of oil and gas, a global logistics consultant, general counsel, and executive director. And we covered many different topics and competencies: communication, credibility, ethics, corporate social responsibility, and any other issues we thought might come up in these speaker talks. And I built a curriculum around those. We really had 4 goals. I wanted to prompt students to think critically about the realities of workplace communication and give them exposure to a bunch of different perspectives and examples, and give them that real world insight into what it's like to negotiate complex communication and ethical situations in the workplace. But I also wanted to demonstrate the impact of this type of course to my leadership, to show that it developed their critical thinking and their soft skills. To pilot this type of course might also create opportunities for other departments or disciplines to adopt and adapt this structure to continue building the soft skills across the college. So critical thinking and writing is not an old concept, right? So Bean took a problem-solving approach. Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive learning objectives have informed a lot of work by Anderson and Krathwohl. And this notion of writing to engage in WAC is described as a view of writing as a means of engaging students in critical thinking. According to the WAC Clearinghouse, this contextualizes sort of this third space of writing to engage, in between those two strands we're most familiar with, writing to learn and writing to communicate, or writing in the disciplines. This space in between, focused on writing to engage, brings in those Bloom competencies about evaluating, analyzing, applying, and understanding that ask students to go deeper in their thinking. Last year, PalmQuest added on to this idea to add reflecting as a very distinct cognitive activity that students can engage in. And he says, doing so really allows us to explore assignments well suited to helping students move beyond their initial understanding of disciplinary content and processes to a deeper engagement with information, ideas, and arguments central to a discipline. And so you can see the overlap in this really nice visual below that shows sort of the space that a writing to engage approach can occupy and the impact it can have on students. And so building this curriculum, I had the writing to engage mindset at the forefront, which prompted me to really think about what kind of critical thinking activities do I want these students engaging in. And so each student over the course of our semester together remembered speaker information to generate questions, reflected on each speaker's talk in a short synthesis paper, critiqued and compared the different speakers' guidance and approaches using our discussion board, applied course concepts, and created activities so they could actually lead a discussion on a particular issue that was raised, created a collaboratively researched and written profile of each of the speakers to contribute to that larger book project, and then reflected on their own experiences and growth over the semester. I essentially had 3 questions in mind that I wanted to be able to explore and answer after the semester ended. First, how can writing to engage activities like those I just mentioned facilitate disciplinary dialogue that might activate students' critical thinking and help them further develop professional identity? To what extent did this writing to engage curriculum contribute to students' development of disciplinary knowledge? And then 3, what political and logistical challenges and affordances did we encounter during this process and have to be negotiated anytime there's a WAC collaboration? First, disciplinary dialogue. I saw this occurring in many different ways. I asked students to create thoughtful questions to ask the speakers, but they were based on a collection of information I curated about each speaker. Their resume, any biographies I could find online, news releases, reports they had offered. So they had to dig deep into that to find an opportunity for a question that couldn't be answered by any of these documents. Then they synthesized and reflected after each speaker visited our class. And I found that those conversations, when we were debriefing about the speaker after they had left, were the most fruitful. Students were sharing their experiences in the workplace, connecting their own experiences to the things the speakers had said, talking about case study scenarios and their own experiences navigating those complex workplace situations. And then this collaborative writing that they were a part of really invited diverse values and insights as they had to negotiate what issues they wanted to present to an audience of their peers for this book project. One activity in particular was mentioned in my feedback repeatedly. This insight sheet is something I just made to help them guide a note-taking process when they were listening to the speakers. But I wanted them to be identifying and thinking about keywords and themes, questions that they might ask from what they were hearing, and then takeaways and advice that could go into that chapter. Several students mentioned how helpful this was in generating conversations after the speaker and then informing the eventual book chapters they wrote. One student said, even though the speakers themselves were obviously the point of the course and very enriching, Being able to hear the other students' opinions and how they took certain things was eye-opening and allowed me to see the discussion through their eyes. Not only did I get my own thoughts and perspectives, but we were able to share and debate. And at many points, I felt like a facilitator, where I was watching students interact and talk and bring in insights and theories from their own majors, from different classes, and sort of engaging in this very thoughtful discussion of the different ways that these situations could be handled. Another student said, I feel the group discussions we had in the class were very beneficial. It was easy to get the class involved and also brought different insights over topics the speakers spoke about. So by bringing in these outside perspectives, it really did create an environment where people wanted to share and they wanted to kind of trouble these things that they were hearing about. In terms of disciplinary awareness raising, I wanted to know if this writing to engage curriculum at all contributed to students' development of higher level discipline specific ways of knowing, as well as those lower level task specific pieces of information. This class was comprised of students from all the different business majors. And so we were thinking in terms of the discipline of business. And what I saw happening was the overarching theme was students' awareness that a lot of these communication and ethical decisions were made in a gray area. And they were marked about how, it's not clear what's right or wrong here. And that's where a lot of that negotiation and discussion took place is, well, I would do this or I would do this, and here's why. They also had some exposure to some very tense workplace conflicts, these stories that the speakers would share about workplace relationships, how they built them, how they navigated them, and what to expect from corporate cultures of different sizes with different values and missions. We also had some speakers share stories that gave the students insight into intercultural issues, such as customs, expectations. One story from a speaker was how they were having dinner in New York and their visitors from another country left an envelope of money on the dinner table. And it caused a big situation with his boss and their collaborators. And there was this discussion of custom and what's appropriate and what could potentially have some ethical implications for both sides. And that was one that really stuck out to the students and something they continue talking about. Other speakers also gave a lot of insight into what they look for when they're hiring interns or entry-level professionals and the kinds of questions they could expect from an interview. The students loved that insight in ways they hadn't even thought about presenting themselves or talking about their future goals. And then in terms of the low-level task-specific knowledge, several of the speakers, without our prompting, brought documents, contracts, links to websites, reports that they had been a part of to show the students what these documents look like and the decisions that they made in creating these documents. A few key quotes from our end of semester survey echo this idea. The most beneficial to me were the speaker reflections. I feel that this was helpful because it helped me dig deeper into what the speaker was saying and relate to the stories. The most beneficial topics for me when we talked about things like whether or not there was a difference between business ethics and personal ethics. This became another overarching theme of the class as students tried to negotiate and understand how their personal values informed their business ethics. She says, after this class, I always think about whether the decisions I'm going to make or other people would make were ethical. It caused me to be more aware and helped me to make good decisions. And finally, the activity that helped me the most would be the speaker's reflection. It helped me not only improve my writing skills, but allowed me to see the ethical problems many industries faced. What was striking to me about these, and these are representative of what the students said overall, is they were all talking about the value of reflecting, those reflective papers, the sitting and the thinking about how they could relate to those stories, what it means to them in terms of their experiences and their values. And finally, what political and logistical challenges and affordances came from this collaboration between my department, General Business and Finance, and the management department. In the beginning, there were a lot of questions about compensation and staffing. I was the instructor of record, and I taught it under a special topics course prefix, which took me off of teaching our core class, and that had to be negotiated. Neither of us received any extra compensation, and there were some staffing concerns about doing so. Another issue that we ran into was no funding, no budget. So we would love to offer an honorarium for the speaker's time and labor to come and share with us. We brought in coffee and treats every time to create a reception because we were practicing networking skills. And then the eventual printing of the book. Was it from my department? Was it from the management department? And we ended up asking our dean's office for funding there. So these were just some details that we didn't know about necessarily at the beginning of this idea. We learned a lot about copyright and how to protect the students' work, our own contributions to the book, and then who should own the copyright, as well as who would then have the extra copies and be able to sell them. We're working with that right now. But some really amazing benefits that we didn't even know we would get out of this experience was the idea that she and I both became curators of resources. And we learned a lot more about each other's disciplines and the ways that we often teach the same kinds of things. And so we began working together to really bolster those topics, those competencies, and sharing the resources that we both had that we were bringing into our own classes. And then finally, in connecting back to the idea of writing to engage, thinking critically about what kind of critical thinking we want students to do can really help us align those tasks with our overarching course objectives. By working together and having those deeper conversations of what do we want students to get out of this, I think it led to a more thoughtful, comprehensive curriculum than if I had tried to do it on my own. And finally, for future courses, this is the book that we put out. We would love for it to become a series to diversify our speakers. Pre-COVID, we had commitments from medical professionals, someone from the Houston Opera, community outreach advocate, people in the finance and wealth management sectors. So we'd like to diversify the speakers. We also learned from having to transition mid-semester due to COVID that we could have a lot more opportunities to engage with people over Zoom, as opposed to having live speakers come to the classroom. And then we also hope that other departments will pick this idea up to create a discipline-specific course. I've had a conversation with our business law faculty about creating a speaker series experience with attorneys and district attorneys coming in. And so we see a lot of potential opportunities for this. And these are some of our graduating seniors with their books. It was an amazing experience for them and for us. I'd be happy to answer any questions about the experience. Thank you.
Thanks for playing that deal for us, Michael. Lindsay and I are here for the next 7 amazing minutes to answer any questions that you have for either one of us about her amazing ethics book, which is fantastic, or my dipping into problems that I create for myself. I saw a hand raised, but there's Allison, you had a question, and there's also one in the chat from
Hi. I love both of these presentations. I am the WAC director at a community college, and I'm particularly interested in the writing assignments you had for your business writing course. Are you willing to share any of those at all? I'm trying to give ideas to folks in that area of, just ways of scaffolding assignments and trying to make it a little more, real out there in the world. And I was just wondering how willing you are to share that kind of stuff.
I'm willing to share a version of it. Some of it, because I'm hoping to do a study on it, I'm a little more hesitant, but there's other like older versions of it or altered versions that aren't particularly part of this that I'm more than happy to share and to have a conversation about.
Totally understandable.
Yeah, some of them are not the easiest to teach, and so they might require a little bit of conversation around.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Amy, your question in the chat was about the ethics book that the students developed and whether or not it's available for consumption online.
Sorry, yes. It is, we hope it will be. Right now, it's just in printed form, but what we're setting up in part of the disbursement idea is we're setting up an online store through our universities to apparently make it accessible online. So it's in the works.
Any other questions for Lindsay or myself?
I have a very ill-formed question, so bear with me while I kind of spin it out in my brain. I'm trying to make a connection between.
As long as it's not a comment, Chris.
I don't think it's a comment. I think I was interested in, like, Lindsay brought up the idea about gray areas, you know, and that's where you really have to like leverage the critical thinking. And then I started thinking about, like, you know, the one guy, Sherry, who was like, oh, you're just trying to make the white people feel bad in his comments. And I'm wondering, like, is there some way to get that guy to see that it's not about making you feel bad, but about those gray areas, right? When your diverse team isn't getting along, and how do you navigate that and manage that in some of those, you know, discursively as well as like ethically and empathetically and those sorts of things. I don't know. Like I said, ill-formed question, but have you thought about that, Sherry, and have you sort of tried to shift his thinking in that way?
I encounter a lot of student resistance, just like in my life. I feel like it's part of my personality. But I think one of the things that I try to do with all of my students, but particularly white male students who I usually get along with because I'm just sort of in your face and tell it like it is, but is to have them turn it around, right? So like, if you're like, oh, we just want to make you feel bad. Well, why do you feel badly? Like, what is it about your experience or about what your expectations are to where you're feeling poorly about this? And then giving them more resources, right? So let's read another article. Let's watch this video. Let's hear from the voices of folks of color and their experiences and how they feel badly. And so I don't try to win over every one of my students with these conversations. Some of them are just lost causes. They have an entire life, an entire career to figure out some of this. My goal is to get them thinking about it, to see that everything's not a-okay, and everything isn't dire either. So that's sort of my approach with any resistant students on a difficult topic, especially as a Black woman, where difficult topics sound harsher coming from me than maybe they do from a different body.
That's helpful. And Lindsay, I was curious to have any of the these questions about DEI topics come up in your discussions in your course too?
One, the speaker who was the advocate for the manager for the diversity also was the diversity inclusion manager and responsible for the hiring portion of that and some on-site training and mentoring. And he did bring in a lot in his presentation about those issues. Interestingly, we had a much more diverse group of speakers pre-COVID and lost a few. And so afterwards we thought, oh my, they're all white except one. And we like recognized that was something that we just had to contend with. And so our observation was that a lot of those conversations didn't happen but when that one speaker spoke, they got really into it. I noticed our business bros, I had some of those in my class, were silent. And so we didn't elicit any feedback specifically on those issues, but I did sense not like active hostile resistance, but more maybe intimidation to engage in those discussions where the other students were doing that. And so that is something that she and I have talked about, to bring in more of those conversations explicitly, because we do recognize that that was sort of an untapped area that could have enriched a lot of it. Yeah. Go ahead.
I will say briefly that coming into the entire semester and students knowing from day one that this is what we're talking about, they talk versus like, oh, now we're to the race stuff and now I can be silent. It's like day one, we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, access. We're talking about different able bodies. We're talking about race. We're talking about gender. We're talking about having babies at work. And they're like, okay, Dr. Craig. And I think because they don't have alternatives, right? Like you either write about this or you drop my course and you need this course to graduate and every section is full. I think that gets them talking versus other spaces where they probably would shut down and have shut down for me. We want to thank y'all so much, all 25 or 23 of you who have stuck it out all the way to the 5 o'clock session. You can reach both me and Lindsay at our through the WABA thing and through our emails. Thank you for joining us and thank you for your positivity in this Monday afternoon.